Morning, Rabosai. We're going to talk a little bit about Levona in the context of Menachos. And we're here on page Yud Beis. As far as Levona is concerned, we said that the Levona was inside the Kli together with the Soles, and he did the Kmitza on the Soles, placing the Levona on a different side of the Kli. Once he finishes the Kmitza, now he's going to collect all the Levona, and he's going to take it out of the Kli. And we'll see what's going to happen with this Levona. Now, at this point, we want to mention a machlokes between Rashi and the Rambam. Rashi is of the opinion that malachtim osa, we collect the Levona after the haktaras hakometz. So in other words, we did the kmitza of the mincha, and now we take that kometz and we burn it on the mizbeach. And afterwards, we're going to take the Levona as a separate Haktorah on the Mizbeach. So there's going to be, according to Rashi, two Haktorahs in every mincha that has a Levona. It's going to be Haktorahs HaMincha and Haktorahs HaLevona. Now he quotes the Rambam. Rambam Maisa Karbonos. And there seems to be a source for this Rambam Masechta Sota, that Noslin Osa B'toch HaKli Shebo Nitan HaKometz. After he takes from the first Kli the Kometz, he places the Kometz in a second Kli. Then he takes the Levona that was also in the first Kli, removes it and puts it into the second Kli. And therefore the Rambam says that there's going to be one Haktorah on the Mizbeach of both Levona and Solos. So as Rashi has two separate Haktoros, one for the Levona and one for the Soles, the Rambam combines them by taking each one, one after the other, out of the original Kli and putting it into the second Kli in order to do the Haktorah of both of them together. Now, this process of gathering together the Levona and placing it into a Kli requires a Kohen. And therefore, Likud Levona Bizarre possible. Now, why is this so? And the Gemara establishes in Masechta Menachos on Daf Yud Gimel that the reason for this is because of what's called halacha. And as we discussed yesterday, I'll just repeat what we said yesterday. I have it here. Okay, I don't have it right now. Excuse me for a second. Oh, I think actually, yeah, okay, I can take it. Right, we said yesterday, just to review, that there are four avodos in Kometz, and they parallel the four avodos in Dam. The first was Kmitza, which is parallel to Shechita. And then we have Halacha. Well, before we get to Halacha, we put the Kometz into a Kli, and that's like Kabbalah Saddam. And then we do the Halachas HaKometz LaMizbeach. And that's like Halachas Hadam. What we're saying now is that just like there's halacha of Halachas HaKometz, which means you bring the Kometz to the Mizbeach, there's also halacha of halacha in Levona, which also has to be burnt on the Mizbeach. But not only that, the avoda of halachas haLevona begins with what's called likud Levona. In other words, he collects the Levona and then he takes it outside of that Kli, putting it into a second Kli, and that's considered an avoda of halacha. So the likud Levona is upgraded to the status of halacha, and therefore requires a Kohen. A zar is possible. Now here the Gemara is going to raise an objection. Normally, halacha in 99 out of 100 cases requires taking it from one location to the other. Like you say, for example, you molech the dam, and what you do is you walk from the place where you were kabbalah dam for the shechita over to the mizbeach. That is called halacha. In this case of likud, he's not walking from any place to another place. He's just doing a ma'isa likud. And the Gemara says that afal pichen, even though it's only doing basically a halacha biyadav, he's collecting the levona from one kli and pouring it into another, that's still called halacha, even though he's not using his feet to transport the levona towards the mizbeh. Now we have a Rambam again. The Rambam says that in general, let's say, for example, in Avodas HaKorbanos, the Kohen would stand right near the Mizbeach, do the Shechita, do the Kabbalah, and then stretch his arm out without moving a step in order to do the Zrika onto the Mizbeach. That's a machlokas in the Gemara, and we paskin that holacha biyadav shelo beregel lav shmei holacha. That when he just stretches his arm out to bring the part of the carbon, in this case the dam, or in our case the levona, closer to the mizbeach, that's not called holacha. And therefore, this entire sugya that excludes a zar because halacha requires a kohen should not apply in the case of levona, because levona, likud levona is halacha sayad and not halacha saregel. The Rambam says, nevertheless, likud levona is pasul bizar, even though it's not technically a halacha, excuse me, because it's halacha biyadav and not beragel. Now, the Mishnah Lamelech on this Rambam says that once the Rambam admits that this halacha of likud levona requiring a kohen exclusion and disqualification of a zar is not based on halacha, because this is halachas yad, likud levona, not halachas regel, says the Mishnah Lamelech, we see now that there are two categories of disqualifying a zar. There's something called an avoda, and the avoda excludes a zar. And then there's something called chashivus, meaning in something that's necessary and you can't do without it, and it's critical, even if it's not technically an avoda, if efshar biladeh you can't do without it, then it has a din of an avoda. It's like the four avodas that we spoke about in Kmitza in a minute. So that's a fascinating breakthrough here, that you could have something that's not technically an avoda, but because of its critical nature, it becomes a chashivus like an avoda, and we require a kohen to the exclusion of a zar. And that's going to be the case of likud levona, according to the Rambam, that since we paskin, again, I'm just going over one more time, that halacha biyadav shelo beraglav lav shmei halacha, therefore likud levona could not be classified and defined as an avoda, and yet the Rambam says is a psul zar. And comes along the Mishnah Lamelech and says, why? Why is it psul zar if it's not an avoda? And the answer is because it has a certain chashivas to it, insofar as it's an absolute requirement. It's not one of the big four in Menachos, the Kmitza leading up to the Torah, which parallel the four avodas of Dam and Zevach, but nevertheless, since it's necessary and it's required, therefore you require a kohen. And in my mind, again, I could be way off the mark in what I say, by sheer association, this reminds me of Hadlakas HaMenorah. because it's very possible that halakha is not an avoda, but nevertheless we need a kohen. Because the Torah says at the beginning of last week's parsha, and it's still before Wednesday, so we're still holding it Baloscha, it says, Amor al Aram, Daber al Aram, Baloscha Saneris. And many Rishonim say that we require a Kohen, and that's derived from Baloscha Saneris. Now, how do you reconcile that with Hadlok Alav Avod? Are we saying that if a Zar is disqualified from Adloka Saminora, then ipso facto we have to elevate the status of Adloka to an Avoda? Not necessarily. Could be that it comes under this kind of a category that we see in the Mishnah Melech in Likut Levona, that within the realm of Kodshim, you could have something that's absolutely necessary to go through an entire day in the Beis HaMikdash, Adloka Saner, and even if it's not technically an Avoda, it requires the Chashivus of a Kohen. Okay, now we get to the Sugya, the Gemara, which debates the issue of what's called a Kli Shal Gabi Karka. Now we said that the Kometz, the Kmitza, has to take place inside of a Kli. In other words, he's co-makes the souls from a Kli, and then he puts it into another Kli. And normally a Kli is defined as something that's not connected to the ground. That which is connected to the ground, it's called Mechubar L'Karka and has a din of Karka. According to Avimi, one of the Amoraim, at the beginning of Masechta Menachos, Ein Komtsumi Kli Shal Gabi Karka. The Kmitza cannot take place from a utensil that's sitting on the ground. Even though, again, it's not attached to the ground, but the very fact that it's placed on the ground, that gives it a quasi-karka status, and is mafkia, and it removes its status as a kli for the purpose of kmitza, because kmitza has to take place from a kli. That's Avimi's position, and therefore, a kohen would be called upon to hold on to the kli, grab it by its handle, and the soles is inside the kli. Now we're ready for kmitza because it's inside a kli. What bothers my mind is why does the kohen have to hold on to the kli for kmitza in midair? I mean, why can't he just put the kli down on another kli, on a shulchan? Why does it have to be that he holds it in his hand? He says, Kol she'ena kli biyad kohen, ein bo toras kli shoretz. He quotes a chiddush of the Brisker Rav. This could have tremendous implication that the status of a kli shoretz as such is contingent upon the fact that the kli is in the hands of a kohen. Mishum she'eno mekadesh el derech sherus. In other words, the kiddush of a kli is because he's using that utensil as part of the avoda, part of the sherus. Ukshu al gavi karka, ein derech sherus b'kaf. How do we integrate the kli into sherus? And the answer is because the kohen is holding on to the kli, and he's doing the sherus. Now the kli is swallowed up as an integral part of sherus, and then the kli could be makadesh. But the kli is not in and of itself capable of being makadesh if it's not the derech sherus. This could answer my question about putting the kli down on a shulchan. The exclusion here is not karka per se. The exclusion is anytime the kohen is not holding on to the kli. So let's just think for a minute about the ketores. So what did we say in the case of the ketores? We said that the machta with the cholim is placed on the floor, and then the Kohen Gadol goes to the lichkas beis avtinus, and he scoops up the ketores in a kli. So the Kohen Gadol is holding on to the kli. Now he comes back to where he put the gachelis down, the machta down, and he's got the ketores in a cup. Now he goes into the Kodesh Kodshim with the machta and the kaf, and he does chafina, according to at least one opinion, in the Kodesh Kodshim from the kaf. So the Gemara says it's in l'chavoda kasha shebimigdash because he's got to be holding on to the kli, and yet he's got to do the chafina from the kli. So he's got to either hold it with his mouth or whatever he does. Very complicated. But again, that would also support this chiddush of the Brisker Rav, that he can't just put the kli on the ground and then scoop up the ketores from the kli on the ground. The kli has to be biyad kohen. So what would be in the following case? Let's say a kohen would shecht an animal, and then he puts a mizrach on the ground, and the dam goes into that mizrach. Could be, according to Brisker Rav, that would be possible because to be makabel dam in a kli means that the kli has to function as a kli sharis, they have sherus, and that only applies if it's biyad kohen. So all this is according to Rav Havimi, who excludes the kli for kmitza if it's laying on the ground. Rav Sheshes and Rava disagree, and they recognize a valid kmitza from a kli that's al gabi karka. From whence did they derive that conclusion? Shekei matzinu b'siluk b'zichei halavona me'ashulchan. Again, this would support what we said before. Again, the bazichi lavona are not on the ground; they're on the shulchan. And when you remove the spoons from the spoons that have the lavona from the shulchan, then shulchan is like karka because it's not biyad kohen. So that Rav Havimi understood that the only time a kli could operate, and in the case of kmitza, we require kmitza mitoch hakli, is only if the kli is biyad kohen. And Rav Sheshes and Rava are going to disprove the premise of Rav Havimi by invoking the case of siluk beziche levona, and we're going to remove the levona in its with the spoons from the shulchan. It's not. So again, just like in the case of kmitza, according to Rav Havimi, let's go over this again. Havimi would say that just like the kmitza need to be tocha kli, it's got to be kli biyad kohen. In case of Ona, doing a siluk from the shulchan. Again, kmitz has to be done mitoch hakli, and levona has to be removed from the shulchan So Rava says in Rav Sheshet that you see that you could even have a kli al gavi karka or al gavi shulchan. There's a halach of siluk. Siluk is an avoda, like kmitz is an avoda. So in menachos where kmitz is avoda, what are you going to tell me that you have to do the kmitz? Right. And the avoda of the kmitz means to take it from the kli. So what are you going to tell me that the kli, if it's not in the hands of the kohen, it's al gavi karka, that's not enough. Because whenever you require the avoda with a kli, it's got to be a kli biyad kohen. So Rav Sheshet and Rava say, what about siluk bazichin? If siluk bazichin shel levona is an avoda, then how could the siluk be effectuated from a shulchan? It's not in a kli that's in the hands. In other words, the levona is in a bazich, but who's holding on to that kli? There's no kohen holding on to the kli. The kli itself is on the shulchan, and the shulchan is not yad hakohen. So when you misale, which is now an avoda, like taking the solus of the mincha and putting it into a kli, how can we do it from a shulchan? How can we do siluk ha bazichin halavona mitoch ha shulchan? Not the yad kohen. So you see that ein tzorach shekohen yagbia b'shas siluk. And so too, you don't need kmitza from a kli biyad kohen. Any kli will do, even if the kli is mudach agavikar. Okay. Now, we said that the komets is whatever fits into the palm of the hand of the kohen. What happens if some of the solace overflows? Right? So you can imagine that he's got solace outside of his fingers. And he takes that solace and he puts it into a kli. Now he has more than the kmitza. Im komatz yosef mishir kmitza, hakometz posel. And that's what the Gemara calls kometz mivuratz. Mivuratz means it's overflowing. And now he quotes a machlokas between two different Rashis. One Rashi, which is Rashi al Torah, says that Yotza bichutz l'sholosh etzbos emtsoyos. There was more solace that came out of the three fingers, meaning in that pocket of air between his three fingers and his palm. Now, what he was supposed to do was he was supposed to use his pinky and his thumb to shake off all that extra surplus solace, and he failed to do so. So he's got a kovetz meruva because he never bothered shaking off the toppings here, the extra solace, and that passes the korban. However, Rashi, not in his Pirush al Torah, but Rashi in his Pirush al Menachos, says that Shalo hitzmid b'shas hakmitza es roshe etzbosav l'kach yoda. What he did was when he did the kmitza, he grabbed whatever he grabbed, and he didn't push and press his three fingers down on the palm of his hand. So what he grabbed is a lot more than the kometz. And that's called kometz yoser mishir kmitza. Emach chotzeitz beino levein kaf hayad. What does he mean? The kemach chotzes. Not sure why he uses the word kemach here. V'chein kometz shechaser posel. Okay, so now we have another category, the exact flipped opposite. Till now we had a kometz that was mushroomed. Now we have a kometz that is diminished in size. Kigon, shalo pasha des elsvos al kaf yado el kometz al yidei kipul etzva osa. So in other words, instead of taking his fingers flat, which allows him to take more of a kometz, he bunched up his fingers, he bent them up like at the knuckles, and there's very little kometz inside, trapped in the very small airspace between his bent fingers and his palm. V'chein im hela yachad im kometz srar o garir melech o kort levona kometz chaser. Shekein kol elu mechasrim mishiura. But what happens if he has certain particles, foreign particles, like little pebbles or salt, or even for that matter, some levona? Because as we said yesterday, he has to separate the levona from the kometz in the kli, because otherwise the velo kamta will be chaser. And in all those cases, since he diminished the shear, it's possible. Now, we have the case of someone, a Kohen, who leaves the kaf yad outside of the solas. The halacha of kmitza requires that the entire hand go into the solas. He left part of his hand outside the solas, right? So he puts in his fingers, but the palm of his hand is outside of the solas. It's not submerged in the solas. He only submerged his 3 fingers into the solas. So the Gemara vacillates back and forth. What's the status of such a kmitza? But we have to add another proviso here. Again, initially he left the palm of his hand outside of the solas. But then afterwards, Ichziron lekaf hayad v'kametz molei kumtza. If I understand correctly, he did this in 2 stages. Stage number 1, he submerged his fingers and only his fingers into the solas, leaving his calf outside of the solas. Stage number 2, Hichziron lekaf hayad and now, in a sense, he's doing a whole new Maisa Kmitza. Because Kmitza requires that the Kaf Yad go into the solas. And he only did that after he started scooping up with his fingers the solas. So the Gemara is not sure what's the status of that Kmitza. Can I integrate A plus B? The first kmitza was with his etzbos, and the second part of the kmitza with his kaf hayad. What do we say? No, it's possible. That's the first suffix. Then we have a suffix about komatz me'atzdodin. So again, instead of putting his hands, his fingers, his three fingers into the soles, he pushed the soles from the side into his hand. The Gemara has a suffix whether that's considered kmitza. And here he quotes Rashi that hasafik be'ofen shehiniach es gav yodo al hasoles v'holicha aleha ad shenichnaso letocha derech hatzad. He turned over his hand and he placed the back of, well, front, I guess you call it the front of his hand. The palm is the back of his hand. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's true. But anyway, we'll use that for. So the front of his hand is now in the soles. And what he starts doing is he starts moving his hand inside the soles until some of it overflows, some of the fine flour overflows into his hand. That's a suffix in the Gemara. However, Rashi offers another possibility in what the suffix is. Lo kider kmitza sheponim kaf sheponim kaf hayad, that the palm of his hand should go towards, to be facing towards the soles. But rather, he turned his hand upside down. The Yesha Pirchu. Oh, now he quotes Tosfos. Shehichnis es Roshei etzvaosav l'soles kishegav kaf hayad uklape hasoles lo kederech kmita shepnim kaf hayad uklape hasoles. V'yesha Pirshu, now he has another sheet of Tosfos. Shemilamata milamala shekodem hichnis letoch hasoles kaf yodo v'dachak ba ad shenichnesu roshi etzbosav letocha. So instead of putting his fingers in first, he puts in his kaf yad and he keeps pushing it down, down, down until finally the soles reaches his etzbos. So all these cases are unusual kmitzos. And the question is, does that automatically disqualify the kmitza? And finally, mincha shechetzia munachas bekli echad, vechetzia bekli acher, efshal likmots mizu al zu. You can only do a kmitza on that which is in that same kli. You can't do a kmitza on something that's outside the kli. All the parts of the soul should be in one kli. So now we can do a kmitza for everything. Omnam im shnei chatzoya minchu munachim b'tocha kli af al pi she'ein nogim ze b'zeh l'das rova hakli mitzarfa. So he's got two halves of a mincha in one kli, but they're not touching each other. This is very typical of laws of truma, parshas truma. You have different parts of the dough, but they're on one table or one inside one kli. That's called tziruf sal. Similar halacha here, according to Rava, that you have a tziruf sal, and you could do a kmitza from one half onto the other half because they're all in one kli, and that integrates them into one. Abaye vacillates back and forth about this question. Okay, then, so we'll make a note of where we got up to, and that's Matan Kli here on page Yud Beit.